The rain fell in a relentless drizzle, turning the cracked pavement of Lincoln Avenue into a slick, gleaming river of gray. It was the kind of small-town evening where every shadow felt alive, pressing against the flickering glow of street lamps. The air was thick with dampness, carrying the faint metallic scent of rain mixed with the acrid tang of gasoline from a nearby station. Outside the old brick police station, the hum of passing cars barely masked the murmurs of a growing crowd. People gathered under umbrellas, peering through the misty evening as if drawn by the magnetic pull of something they couldn't quite explain. Inside, the tension was suffocating. Officer Gerald Kent leaned against his desk, his uniform crisp but his demeanor anything but. A man in his late 40s, he wore the weight of authority on his shoulders like armor, his sharp jawline and piercing blue eyes an unspoken challenge to anyone who dared question him. To the townsfolk, Kent was a fixture, a figure as immovable as the courthouse steps. But behind the badge, he carried a simmering resentment that boiled just beneath the surface. Tonight, that resentment had found a target. In the corner of the room, the twins sat side by side on the cold metal bench, their small hands cuffed in front of them. Micah and Malik Williams, barely 16, were mirror images of each other, soft brown eyes filled with confusion and defiance, their matching hoodies soaked from the rain. The cuffs looked oversized on their slender wrists, a cruel contrast to their youth. They didn't belong here, and everyone in the room knew it. Stupid kids, Kent muttered under his breath, his voice low enough to sound like a growl, but loud enough for the words to carry. He didn't bother to hide the disdain in his tone. Caught them loitering outside the grocery store, always up to no good, just like the rest of them. He didn't name names. He didn't have to. The unspoken code of the town filled in, the blanks. The boys said nothing. Micah sat stiffly, his jaw clenched while Malik stared at the floor, his lips pressed into a thin line. Their silence wasn't an admission of guilt. It was a shield, one they'd learned to hold up from years, of quiet warnings from their parents. Don't give them a reason. Don't let them see fear. But even shields can crack, and Malik's foot tapped against the floor in a nervous rhythm, betraying the storm churning inside him. Across the room, Officer Claire Donovan shuffled papers at her desk, her discomfort evident in the way she avoided Kent's gaze. Claire was new to the department, fresh out of the academy, and still clinging to the idealistic belief that justice was blind. But tonight, that belief felt paper-thin. She wanted to speak up, to say something, anything, but the weight of Kent's authority and the suffocating silence in the room pressed her down like a stone. "Look at me when I'm talking to you," Kent snapped, his voice slicing through the room. Micah lifted his eyes, slow and deliberate, meeting Kent's glare with a quiet strength that made the officer's chest tighten. There was something unsettling about the boy's calmness, as if he saw through the bravado and into the cracks beneath. "We didn't do anything wrong," Micah said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. Kent scoffed, a cruel smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Wrong place, wrong time, huh? Isn't that what you always say?" The words hung in the air, heavy and acidic, and for a moment, the only sound was the faint ticking of the station clock. Claire's eyes darted to the boys, then to Kent, her fingers gripping the edge of her desk. She opened her mouth to speak, but Kent cut her off with a sharp look. "You got something to say, Donovan?" he asked, his tone dripping with condescension. She hesitated, the conflict in her eyes flickering like a candle in the wind. "They're just kids, Gerald," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe we should—" "They're punks," he interrupted, slamming his hand on the desk. The sound echoed through the room, making Claire flinch and Malik jump. "And if we don't teach them a lesson now, they'll think they can walk all over us. Over me." Micah's calm exterior cracked then, just for a moment. "We're not walking over anyone," he said, his voice rising. "You dragged us here. For nothing. We didn't do anything." "Watch your tone, boy," Kent growled, stepping closer, his towering frame casting a long shadow over the twins. The air in the room felt electric, charged with a tension so thick it was almost tangible. Outside, the murmurs of the crowd grew louder, a low hum of unease that seeped through the walls. Someone pressed their face against the window, trying to catch a glimpse of what was happening inside. But the real storm wasn't outside. It was building here in this room between the four of them. And then it happened. The lights flickered, once, twice, before plunging the room into darkness. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of rain tapping against the windows and the sharp intake of breath from Claire. "What the hell?" Kent started, but his words were cut off by a strange low rumble that seemed to rise from the very ground beneath their feet. Micah and Malik exchanged a glance, their eyes wide with something that wasn't fear but recognition, a shared understanding that made the hair on the back of Claire's neck stand on end. The sound grew louder, more insistent, like a heartbeat pounding in the walls, and then, from the shadows came a voice. Deep, resonant, and impossibly calm, it spoke one word. Enough. The room fell deathly silent. Kent froze, his hand hovering near his holster, while Claire's breath hitched in her throat. The twins didn't move, but their eyes flicked to the source of the voice, somewhere beyond the darkness. And then, with chilling certainty, the voice spoke again. "You think you hold the power here?" It was a question, but it carried the weight of a verdict. "You have no idea what you've just unleashed." In that moment, Officer Gerald Kent felt something he hadn't felt in years, an emotion he couldn't explain, but one he couldn't deny. Fear. The darkness that had swallowed the room seemed to stretch time, making each second feel like an eternity. Officer Gerald Kent's breathing grew heavier, his fingers twitching at his side. The voice still echoed in his ears, its weight pressing down on him like a vice. He tried to convince himself it was nothing, just some prank, some trick of the twins, but deep down a seed of doubt had taken root. The flickering light overhead suddenly sputtered back to life, casting the room in its usual harsh fluorescence. Everything looked the same, yet the air felt different, charged with an unspoken warning. Kent's jaw tightened as he scanned the room, his eyes narrowing on the twins. "You think this is funny?" he barked, his voice sharper than intended. "What did you do?" Micah shook his head, his expression calm but resolute. "We didn't do anything," he said, his voice steady, though there was an edge of something deeper, something Kent couldn't place. Malik, quieter than his brother, leaned forward slightly, his chains clinking softly. "Maybe this isn't about us," he said, his tone low but pointed. Kent's eyes flashed with anger. "Don't get smart with me, kid." But Malik's words lingered, hanging in the air like smoke. Micah had always been the one to speak first, to stand up when it mattered most. Growing up on the edge of town, the twins had learned early on that the world wasn't kind to boys who looked like them. Their mother, Denise, had done her best to shield them from the harsher realities of life in a place like Lincoln. But even her warm, protective presence couldn't soften every blow. Micah still remembered the day she sat them down at the kitchen table, her hands clasped tightly around a chipped coffee mug. Her eyes, usually filled with laughter, were clouded with worry as she spoke. "Listen to me," she'd said, her voice steady but laced with an urgency that made their young hearts race. "There are people out there who will judge you before you even open your mouth. Not because of what you've done, but because of who you are. You have to be smarter, quieter, better. Do you understand?" They'd nodded, though they didn't fully understand then. Over the years, her words became a mantra, a shield against the stares, the whispered comments, the moments when doors were closed in their faces for reasons no one would admit aloud. But Micah wasn't quiet by nature. Where Malik preferred to fade into the background, Micah had a fire in him that refused to be extinguished. He'd learned to channel it, most of the time. Still, there were moments when it slipped out, when the weight of staying silent became too much to bear. Officer Claire Donovan's gaze darted between Kent and the twins, her unease growing with every second. The way Kent was staring at them now, the tension in his shoulders. It wasn't just anger. It was fear, though he'd never admit it. "Gerald," she said softly, trying to diffuse the situation. "Maybe we should call it a night. This doesn't feel right." Kent turned to her, his expression dark. I don't need your advice, Donovan. These two, he jabbed a finger toward the twins, need to learn that actions have consequences. Claire hesitated. She'd only been on the force for 6 months, but it didn't take long to learn how things worked in Lincoln. Kent's word was law, and questioning him rarely ended well. But tonight something felt different. The twins didn't look scared, not in the way most people did when faced with Kent's wrath. There was a quiet determination in their eyes, a strength that made her pause. "You're making a mistake," Micah said suddenly, his voice cutting through the room. Kent turned on him, his face twisting with barely concealed rage. "Excuse me?" Micah met his gaze without flinching. "You're so sure you've got all the power, but you don't even see what's coming." The word sent a shiver down Claire's spine. Kent stepped closer to the bench where the twins sat, looming over them like a storm cloud. "Is that a threat?" he hissed. "No," Micah said, his tone calm. "It's a warning." The silence that followed was deafening. Kent stared at Micah, his hands balled into fists at his sides. For a moment, it seemed like he might lash out, but then he stepped back, shaking his head. "You think you're real clever, don't you?" he muttered. "Let's see how clever you are when your parents come to pick you up." Micah's lips twitched into a faint, almost imperceptible smile. "Good luck with that," he said. Outside, the rain had eased, leaving the street slick and gleaming under the streetlights. The small crowd that had gathered earlier had dispersed, but a sense of unease lingered in the air. Back inside the station, Claire leaned against her desk, her thoughts racing. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this than she understood. Something about the twins, about the way they carried themselves even in the face of Kent's hostility, made her think of her younger brother. Aaron had been like Micah in so many ways, fiercely intelligent, unafraid to speak his mind and always looking out for others. But Aaron hadn't been lucky enough to survive the system. The memory of his trial, the way the judge dismissed, every argument his lawyer made still haunted her. She glanced over at the twins, her heart tightening. They shouldn't be here. They didn't belong in this station, cuffed and treated like criminals for standing outside a grocery store. "Hey," she said, walking over to them. "Are you two okay?" Micah nodded slowly, his eyes meeting hers. "We're fine," he said, though there was an edge of exhaustion in his voice. Malik didn't look up, but he muttered, "This isn't new." Claire's chest ached at the quiet resignation in his tone. She opened her mouth to say something, but before she could, the strange rumble from earlier returned. This time it was louder, more insistent, like the growl of an unseen beast. The lights flickered again, and then, without warning, the glass window behind her desk shattered. The room erupted into chaos. Kent shouted, reaching for his weapon while Claire instinctively shielded the twins. A cold wind rushed through the station, carrying with it a sound that made her blood run cold, a low, guttural whisper that seemed to come from everywhere, and nowhere at once. Micah and Malik exchanged a glance, their expressions unreadable but tinged with a strange sense of purpose. "What is this?" Kent shouted, his voice cracking. Micah turned to him, his expression calm despite the chaos. "We told you," he said. "You don't know what you've unleashed." Before Kent could respond, the whispering grew louder, coalescing into words that seemed to pierce the very walls of the station. "Judgment begins." The lights went out again, plunging them into darkness. The oppressive darkness stretched on, for what felt like an eternity. The whispering voices clawed at the air, their chilling cadence seeping into the marrow of everyone in the room. Micah's breath hitched, but he kept his composure, leaning ever so slightly toward Malik. "Stay calm," Micah whispered, though his voice carried a tremor that belied his words. Kent, on the other hand, wasn't composed in the slightest. He fumbled for his flashlight, cursing under his breath as it clattered to the floor. The sound echoed unnaturally, amplifying his frustration. "Enough of this!" Kent roared into the void, his voice raw with anger and something darker. Fear. He pulled his gun from its holster, aiming it into the shadows as if it would somehow silence the whispers. "Show yourself." Claire flinched at the sound of his voice. Her instincts told her this was no ordinary situation, no petty prank or clever ruse, the broken glass and the guttural voices. They were unlike anything she'd encountered before. "Gerald, put the gun down," she said carefully, edging closer to him. "You don't even know what you're aiming at." Kent snapped his head. Toward her, his face twisted in anger. "Don't tell me what to do, Donovan. Someone's responsible for this, and I'm going to get to the bottom of it." From their corner, Malik's soft voice cut through the tension. "You still don't get it, do you?" Kent rounded on him, his gun now pointed squarely at the boy. Malik didn't flinch, his calm gaze meeting Kent's wild eyes. "What did you say to me?" Kent growled. Micah's heart pounded as he stepped in front of his brother, blocking the barrel of the gun with his own chest. His voice was steady, but his fists clenched tightly at his sides. "He said you don't get it. You're so busy trying to control everything, but this—" He gestured vaguely to the darkness around them. "This isn't something you can control." Kent's finger twitched on the trigger, but before he could respond, the whispers swelled again, louder and more coherent. "Judgment begins with the wicked." The gun fell slightly as Kent's eyes darted around the room, his composure slipping further. He turned back to the twins, his voice cracking. "What the hell is this? What are you doing to me?" Micah's mind raced. He didn't fully understand what was happening, but he knew one thing. This wasn't about him or Malik. Not directly, anyway. Something much bigger was at play. Something that seemed to feed off of Kent's hostility, his fear. It reminded him of a story their grandmother used to tell. Late at night, she'd sit by the fire, her weathered hands wrapped around a cup of tea, and speak in a voice that was equal parts comforting and unsettling. "There's a balance to everything," she'd say, her gaze distant as if peering into another world. "You can't go through life spreading poison and expect the earth to stay silent. It always answers, sometimes loudly, sometimes softly, but it always answers." Micah hadn't thought about her words in years, but now they rushed back to him with startling clarity. Was this the answer she'd spoken of? Was the earth answering Kent's poison? The lights flickered back on, but they were dimmer than before, casting long, eerie shadows across the room. Kent's face was pale, his grip on his gun slack as his eyes darted between the twins and the shattered window. "Listen to me," he said, his voice hoarse. "You two know something about this. You're going to tell me what's going on, or so help me." "Or what?" Micah interrupted, his voice rising. For the first time that night, the frustration and fear bubbling inside him spilled out. "You'll throw us in a cell? Rough us up? Do what you always do when you feel threatened?" Kent's eyes narrowed, but Micah pressed on, his voice steady now, the fire in him reigniting. "You think you're in control, but you're not. This isn't about us, it's about you. And maybe, just maybe, you've finally pushed too far." The room fell silent again, the weight of Micah's words pressing down on everyone. Even Claire looked stunned, her gaze darting between Kent and the twins. Malik, still seated on the bench, finally spoke. His voice was soft but firm, carrying an edge that hadn't been there before. "We didn't ask for this, but it's here now, and it's not going to stop until it gets what it wants." Kent sneered, though the fear in his eyes betrayed him. "And what does it want?" Malik looked up at him, his expression unreadable. "Justice." The room grew colder, the temperature dropping so quickly that Claire could see her breath. She hugged herself, her teeth chattering as she looked around. "We need to leave," she said, her voice trembling. "Whatever this is, it's not safe." Kent scoffed, though the sound was hollow. "Leave? And let them walk away? Not a chance." As he spoke, the whispers returned, louder and angrier than before. The sound seemed to vibrate through the walls, shaking the furniture and causing the fluorescent lights to flicker wildly. Micah and Malik exchanged a glance, their connection so deep that words weren't necessary. Micah nodded subtly, and Malik rose to his feet, his movements deliberate and calm despite the chaos around him. "You can't fight this," Malik said, his voice carrying an eerie certainty. "You can only face it." Kent's grip on his gun tightened, his knuckles white. "You don't tell me what I can and can't do," he spat. But before he could take another step, the air in the room shifted. A sudden, deafening silence fell, as if the world itself had taken a breath and was holding it. Then from the corner of the room, a figure emerged. The figure was cloaked in shadow, its features obscured, but its presence was undeniable. It radiated power, its every step echoing through the room despite the absence of sound. Kent stumbled backward, his gun falling from his hand as his legs hit the edge of his desk. "What is that?" he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. Micah and Malik didn't move, their eyes fixed on the figure. There was no fear in their expressions, only a quiet acceptance. The figure stopped in the center of the room, its gaze, or what felt like its gaze, settling on Kent. When it spoke, its voice was neither male nor female, neither young nor old. It was simply timeless. "Gerald Kent," it said, the name ringing out like a tolling bell. "You have sown seeds of hatred and fear. Now you must reap what you have sown." Kent shook his head, his voice cracking as he pleaded. "I didn't mean... I was just doing my job." The figure tilted its head, as if considering his words. "Your job was to protect and serve, but you chose to harm and oppress." Claire watched in stunned silence, her heart pounding in her chest. She wanted to intervene, to say something, but she felt rooted to the spot, her body frozen by the sheer gravity of the moment. Micah stepped forward then, his voice breaking through the tension. "You can't outrun this," he said, his tone calm but firm. "It's not about what you say now, it's about everything you've done." The figure turned its attention to Micah, and for a brief moment its features softened. "And you," it said, its voice quieter now. "You carry the weight of those who came before you. Do not falter. The path ahead is difficult, but it is necessary." Micah swallowed hard, the words hitting him like a tidal wave. He thought of his mother, his grandmother, and every lesson they'd instilled in him. He thought of Malik, his quiet strength a constant anchor, and he thought of himself, of the fire inside him that refused to be extinguished. The figure turned back to Kent, its form seeming to grow larger, more imposing. "Your time is up," it said simply. The room plunged into darkness once more, and Kent's screams echoed through the station. The cold lingered in the room long after the darkness lifted. The fluorescent lights buzzed weakly, casting faint, flickering shadows that seemed alive. Officer Kent was slumped against his desk, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His face was pale, his eyes darting wildly as if expecting the figure to reappear at any moment. Micah and Malik stood side by side, their calm a stark contrast to the chaos unraveling around them. Claire, frozen in place, could hardly comprehend what had just transpired. The figure, its haunting words, the suffocating weight of judgment, it was all too much. "Micah," Malik whispered, his voice low but firm. "We can't stay here." Micah nodded, glancing toward Claire, who was still staring at Kent. "We need to go now," he said, his voice loud enough to snap her out of her daze. Claire blinked, turning to him. "Go? Where do you think you're going?" Her tone was sharper than she intended, but it was laced with fear, not authority. "Somewhere safer than here," Micah replied, his eyes steady on hers. "Whatever this is, it's not done. And if we stay, none of us will make it out." Kent stirred, his trembling, hands reaching for his fallen gun. His grip was weak and it clattered to the floor again. His eyes darted to Micah, his fear quickly morphing into rage. "You," he spat, his voice shaking. "This is your fault." Micah clenched his fists, his patience fraying. "How is this our fault?" he shot back. "You're the one who—" "Shut up," Kent bellowed, staggering to his feet. His posture was unsteady, but his glare was venomous. "You think you're so clever, don't you? But I'm in charge here. Not you, not whatever that thing was." "Then take charge, Gerald," Claire said, stepping between him and the twins. Her voice was firm, but there was a tremor beneath it. "Do your job, but pointing fingers and shouting isn't going to fix this." Kent's face contorted with frustration, his fists clenched at his sides. You don't understand, Donovan. They're playing some kind of game. No one's playing games, Malik interrupted, his voice calm but cutting. You've been fighting this thing from the start, and that's why it's coming for you. Claire's head snapped toward him. What thing? What's coming? Micah hesitated, then sighed. We don't know exactly, he admitted. But whatever it is, it's bigger than us, bigger than him. He gestured toward Kent. It's feeding off the worst parts of him. That's ridiculous, Kent snarled. But, even as he said it, doubt flickered in his eyes. Is it? Malik asked quietly. Think about what it said. Judgment begins with the wicked. You've been judging us from the moment you saw us. Maybe now it's your turn. A loud crash interrupted them, the sound reverberating through the station. All heads turned toward the front entrance, where the heavy glass doors now lay in shards on the floor. The air grew colder, and a deep guttural rumble filled the space, shaking the walls. It's here, Malik said, his voice barely above a whisper. Kent scrambled back, his bravado crumbling. What do you mean, it's here? He demanded, his voice cracking. Micah didn't answer. He grabbed Malik's arm and pulled him toward the side exit. We're leaving. Claire hesitated, torn between her duty and the gnawing sense that staying here would be a mistake. You can't just... You're welcome to stay if you want, Micah said over his shoulder. But whatever's coming, it's not here. For us. They made it halfway down the dimly lit corridor when the station shook again, this time more violently. The emergency lights flickered, bathing the hallway in a stuttering red glow. Malik stumbled, and Micah caught him, his grip firm. We're almost there, Micah urged, though he wasn't sure where there was. Behind them, Claire's voice rang out. Wait! She caught up, her face pale but determined. You're not going anywhere without explaining what's going on. Micah stopped, turning to her. What do you want me to say? That we've got all the answers? We don't. But we do know one thing. Kent is the key to all of this. Whatever's happening, it's tied to him. Claire's eyes widened. You think it's punishing him? Micah nodded. And we're collateral damage if we stay too close. A sudden, bone-chilling scream echoed through the station, cutting through the tense silence. Malik flinched, and Claire's hand went to her holstered weapon. That was Kent, she said, her voice tight. We can't help him, Micah said firmly, though his resolve was tested by the desperation in the scream. He's made his choices. Now he has to face them. Claire hesitated, but another scream, louder and more agonized than the first, made the decision for her. I have to try, she said, turning back toward the main room. Micah grabbed her arm. You don't owe him anything, he said. If you go back, you might not come out. Claire pulled away, her jaw set. And if I don't go back, I'll never forgive myself. Micah stared at her for a long moment, then nodded. Be careful. As Claire disappeared into the darkness, Micah turned to Malik. We need to keep moving. Malik didn't respond. Immediately. He stared down the corridor, his expression unreadable. Do you think this will ever stop? He asked quietly. Micah hesitated, then placed a hand on his brother's shoulder. I don't know, he admitted. But I know we can't give up. Not now. Malik nodded, drawing strength from his brother's determination. Together, they moved deeper into the station, their steps echoing in the empty hallways. Back in the main room, Claire found Kent backed into a corner, his face a mask of terror. The figure from earlier had returned, its form more defined now. It loomed over him, its presence suffocating. Gerald Kent, it intoned, its voice echoing with a supernatural resonance. Your actions have sown pain and suffering. Now you will face the consequences. Kent shook his head, tears streaming down his face. I didn't mean to. I was just doing my job. The figure tilted its head, as if considering his plea. Your job was to serve justice. Instead, you twisted it into a weapon. You judged others without mercy. Now you shall be judged. As the figure raised a hand, Kent let out a strangled cry, his body convulsing as if invisible chains were pulling him down. Claire stepped forward, her voice trembling but resolute. Stop. she shouted. "This isn't the way." The figure turned its gaze on her, its expression unreadable. "Do you seek to defend him?" Claire hesitated, her heart pounding. "I don't defend what he's done, but no one deserves this." The figure stared at her for a long moment before speaking. Compassion, even for the undeserving, a rare virtue. It lowered its hand and Kent collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath. Micah and Malik reached the exit, the cool night air washing over them like a balm. They stopped just outside, their breaths visible in the cold. "Do you think she's okay?" Malik asked, glancing back at the station. Micah didn't answer immediately. He looked up at the sky, the stars obscured by heavy clouds. "I hope so," he said quietly. "But whatever happens, we have to keep moving." As they stepped into the shadows, a low rumble sounded in the distance, a reminder that the night's horrors were far from over. The cold night outside the station had an eerie calm, but inside, the storm was far from over. As Malik and Micah hurried toward safety, a deep rumble resonated from the station, followed by a wave of cold air that seemed to carry whispers, indistinct but filled with anguish. Malik froze, his eyes darting back toward the building. "We can't just leave her," he said, his voice trembling. Micah clenched his jaw, weighing their safety against the growing sense of responsibility gnawing at him. They'd come this far, endured more than they'd ever imagined. Could they live with themselves if they walked away now? Inside, Claire stood frozen, her pulse pounding in her ears as the figure loomed over Kent. The ethereal being's presence felt heavier, now as if the room itself strained under its weight. Kent lay sprawled on the floor, babbling incoherently. "Please." "I'll do anything," he choked out, his voice hoarse. "Just don't let it take me." Claire stepped forward, her gaze flicking between the figure and Kent. "What do you want from him?" she demanded, her voice shaking but firm. "He's not worth it." The figure's head turned slowly toward her, its hollow eyes piercing through her. "And yet you defend him," it said, its voice a blend of sorrow and anger. "Why?" Claire hesitated, trying to steady her racing thoughts. "Because..." She struggled to find the words. "Because vengeance won't fix anything. Justice isn't about destruction. It's about change." The figure's gaze lingered on her, its form flickering like a flame in the wind. "Change," it echoed, the word dripping with skepticism. "Can such a man truly change?" Claire glanced at Kent, who was trembling, his eyes wide with fear. She didn't believe he deserved a second chance, but something in her gut told her this wasn't just about him, it was about something bigger, something darker. "I don't know," she admitted. "But you won't find your answer by destroying him. If you want justice, make him face what he's done." Meanwhile, outside, Malik tugged at Micah's sleeve. "Micah, look." He pointed toward the station windows. A faint, unnatural glow flickered inside, and the brothers exchanged a tense glance. "We have to go back," Malik said firmly. Micah hesitated, then sighed. "Fine, but we're not running in blind." He pulled a small pocket knife from his coat, its blade more symbolic than practical. Malik grabbed a heavy flashlight from a nearby utility box. Armed with little more than their resolve, they slipped back into the station. Inside, the figure stood motionless, considering Claire's words. The tension in the air was palpable. Then, without warning, the glow surrounding it dimmed, and the room plunged into darkness. "Do you think words alone can undo the harm he's caused?" The figure's voice echoed, with haunting visions now emanating from all directions. Standing over frightened men and women. "Shall we recount his badge, a weapon of power and prejudice?" Each image was a window into his cruelty. The mother he'd humiliated in front of her children, the teenager he'd beaten in an alley, the innocent lives shattered by his actions. Kent screamed, clutching his head. "Stop it, please, stop. Face them," the figure demanded. "Feel the weight of what you've done." Claire clenched her fists, stepping closer. "Enough. He knows what he's done, but dragging him through this won't undo the pain he's caused. If you really want justice, let him live with it. Make him answer for it." The figure turned toward her again, its form wavering. And if he does not? Claire swallowed hard. Then it's on him, not you. As Claire and the figure faced off, Micah and Malik crept through the station, their makeshift weapons ready. They followed the faint sounds of voices and stumbled upon the surreal scene in the main room. Micah, Malik whispered, his eyes wide. What is that? Micah shook his head, his gaze fixed on the figure. I don't know, but we can't let it finish whatever it's doing. The figure's head snapped toward the brothers as if sensing their presence. You return, it said, its tone unreadable. Why? Malik stepped forward, his flashlight trembling in his grip. Because this isn't right. Whatever Kent did, this isn't the way to fix it. The figure tilted its head, its gaze shifting between the twins. And what would you know of justice? It asked, its voice softer now. Have you not been wronged? Have you not suffered under the likes of him? Micah took a step forward, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. We have, he said. But we don't want revenge, we want change, and that won't come from destroying him, it'll come from exposing him. The figure seemed to waver, its form flickering as if caught between two states. Exposing him, it repeated. And if that is not enough, it will be, Malik said. If you let the world see what he's done, it will be enough. The room grew silent, the air thick with anticipation. Then, slowly, the figure's glow dimmed further, its form dissolving into a swirling mist. You have chosen a path of mercy, it said, its voice fading. May it lead to the justice you seek. As the mist dissipated, Kent collapsed to the floor, unconscious but alive. Claire let out a shaky breath, her knees nearly buckling beneath her. Micah and Malik rushed to her side. Are you okay? Malik asked, his voice filled with concern. Claire nodded, though she looked as if she'd aged 10 years in the past. Yeah, she said weakly. But we need to make sure this doesn't happen again. The next morning, the station was swarming with activity. Reporters, investigators, and activists crowded the entrance, demanding answers. Word had spread about the strange events, and Kent's history of misconduct had finally come to light. As Kent was led away in handcuffs, his face a mixture of rage and humiliation, Micah and Malik stood nearby, watching in silence. Claire joined them, her expression somber but resolute. You did the right thing, she said quietly. Both of you. Micah glanced at her, his gaze steady. So did you. Later, as the brothers walked away from the chaos, Malik turned to Micah. Do you think it's over? He asked. Micah looked up at the sky, the morning sun breaking through the clouds. Maybe, he said. Or maybe it's just the beginning. The morning after the events at the station was a blur of light and noise. The rising sun cast long shadows on the cracked pavement outside, where journalists and protesters mingled, their voices a mix of outrage and triumph. It was a scene of reckoning, a long overdue confrontation with truths that had been buried for far too long. Inside the small diner across the street, Malik and Micah sat at a corner booth, nursing mugs of coffee. The warmth of the cup in his hands grounded Malik, though his mind still churned with the surreal memories of the night before. You think they'll actually do something about it now? Malik asked, breaking the silence. Micah took a slow sip, his eyes narrowing in thought. They'll have to. It's too big to ignore now. With everything Kent's done out in the open, the department can't just sweep it under the rug anymore. Across the table, Claire nodded, her expression resolute. It's not just about Kent, though. He's one piece of a much bigger problem. The system let him get away with this for years. If we don't push for real changes, it'll just happen again, with someone else. Later that day, the news broke that Officer Kent had not only been suspended, but was facing criminal charges. The evidence collected, statements from victims, internal complaints, and the haunting footage from the night before, painted an unflinching portrait of his abuses of power. As the headlines spread, so did the outrage. Protests grew larger, not just in their city but across the country. People carried signs with messages like, "Justice for all," and "No more silence." It was clear that Kent's downfall was a catalyst, igniting a fire in people who had long felt ignored and dismissed. For Kent, the consequences were swift and harsh. His home was surrounded by reporters, his name dragged through every headline. Former colleagues distanced themselves, and the community he'd once terrorized was now united in ensuring he faced accountability. But perhaps the most significant punishment was the realization of his own fallibility. No longer shielded by his badge, Kent faced a stark and lonely reality. Institutional changes. By the following week, the police department announced a series of immediate reforms. Independent oversight committees were established to review complaints against officers, and mandatory bias training became a requirement for all personnel. More officers of color were promoted into leadership roles, ensuring diverse voices were finally represented at the top. It wasn't perfect, it never would be, but it was a start. Malik and Micah, though skeptical, couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope as they watched these changes unfold. "It's not enough," Malik said one evening, scrolling through updates on his phone. "But it's something." Micah nodded. "And we'll make sure they don't stop here." Protagonist's reflection. In the quiet moments between the chaos, Malik found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought them here. He thought about their mother, how she had always told them to stand up for what was right, even when it felt like the world was against them. Her words echoed in his mind. "Courage isn't about not being scared, baby. It's about doing the right thing even when you're shaking in your boots." He smiled faintly, imagining her reaction to everything that had happened. She would have been proud, he thought, though she would have fussed over them for putting themselves in danger. For Micah, the experience was a lesson in resilience. He'd always been the cautious one, the skeptic. But standing up that night, facing not just Kent but the fear that had loomed over them for years, had awakened something in him. "I used to think nothing would ever change," he admitted to Claire one evening as they sat on a park bench. "That no matter what we did, the system would just keep grinding us down. But now I think maybe we've got a shot." Claire smiled, her gaze distant as she looked out over the city skyline. "Change doesn't happen overnight," she said. "But every step forward matters, and what you two did, it mattered, more than you know." Community impact. The station incident had ripple effects far beyond their small community. Stories of Kent's downfall inspired others to come forward, sharing their own experiences of injustice. Social media became a powerful tool, amplifying voices that had been silenced for too long. At a town hall meeting a month later, Malik and Micah stood in the back, watching as people of all ages and backgrounds shared their stories. There was pain in their words, but also a sense of empowerment. When it was Malik's turn to speak, he felt a lump rise in his throat. Taking a deep breath, he stepped up to the microphone. "I used to think that our voices didn't matter," he began, his voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm him. "That no one cared about what happened to people like us, but I was wrong. We do matter, our stories matter. And if we keep standing together, if we keep fighting for what's right, we can make a difference. This is just the beginning." The room erupted into applause, and for the first time in a long while, Malik felt a sense of hope he hadn't realized he was missing. Months later, life had settled into a new normal for the twins. Malik had started volunteering at a local youth center, mentoring kids who reminded him of himself at their age. Micah had taken up photography, capturing moments of resilience and beauty in their community. Claire, too, had found a renewed sense of purpose. She'd joined a grassroots organization dedicated to police reform, using her experience to advocate for meaningful change. One evening, the three of them gathered on the rooftop of their apartment building, the city lights stretching out before them. "Do you ever think about how far we've come?" Malik asked, leaning against the railing. Micah chuckled. "All the time. But there's still a long way to go." Claire nodded, her gaze thoughtful. "Yeah. But for the first time, it feels like we're actually moving forward." As the stars began to appear in the night sky, The three of them sat, in comfortable silence, each lost in their thoughts. Malik's heart swelled with a quiet determination. They'd faced so much, fear, pain, injustice, but they'd come out stronger. And while the road ahead would undoubtedly be filled with challenges, he knew they were ready. For the first time, he truly believed that change was possible, and that belief, he realized, was the most powerful weapon they had.